He was kicked out at 17 with $412, no family, and nowhere to go. 12 years earlier, someone bought him something for $8 in a place so cold your lungs freeze when you breathe, at minus 47 degrees, that inheritance would either bury him alive or force him to build a life from nothing. And if you've ever felt disposable, unwanted, or forgotten, you need to hear what happened next. He was kicked out at 17 with $412, no family, and nowhere to go. 12 years earlier, someone bought him something for $8 in a place so cold your lungs freeze when you breathe, at minus 47 degrees, that inheritance would either bury him alive or force him to build a life from nothing. And if you've ever felt disposable, unwanted, or forgotten, you need to hear what happened next. The office was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every movement feel louder than it should. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a smell Ethan had come to associate with waiting rooms, case files, and conversations that never ended well. He sat across from the desk with his shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together so tightly his fingers ached. Across from him, Ms. Harding flipped through a thin folder, her expression carefully neutral. Trained by years of saying difficult things without letting them show, the folder had his name on it. Ethan Cole. That folder was his life. 17 years reduced to paper. Dates, addresses, notes written by strangers who never stayed long enough to know him. Ms. Harding closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. "Your birthday is in 3 weeks," she said, her voice calm, measured. "You'll be 18. Ethan nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. "That means you'll officially age out of the system," she continued. "The state's responsibility ends." Responsibility. Not care, not family. Responsibility. The word landed heavy in his chest. He had been a responsibility for as long as he could remember. Something to be managed until it wasn't required anymore. "We've reviewed your options," Ms. Harding said, sliding a paper toward him. "There's a long wait list for city housing. The youth transitional program in Northridge has an opening." Ethan didn't even look at the paper. He already knew what it said. Bunk beds, shared rooms, rules that changed depending on who was in charge that week. Places where people waited for something better that never came. "No," he said quietly. Ms. Harding looked up, surprise flickering briefly across her face. "Ethan, you don't have many alternatives. You have $412 in your account. That won't last." He stared past her at the gray wall behind the desk. $412. He knew the number by heart. He had counted it in his head more times than he could remember, trying to stretch it, trying to imagine it turning into something more than what it was. It never did. "I'll figure it out," he said. Ms. Harding sighed softly, the sound carrying more exhaustion than frustration. She opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope that didn't belong in that office. Thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with dark green wax. It looked out of place, like it had slipped in from another time. "There's one more thing," she said. This was sent to the department years ago. The instructions were very specific. It was to be given to you at your final meeting. She slid it across the desk. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. His name was written on the front in neat, deliberate handwriting that made something twist in his chest. He recognized it immediately, even though he hadn't seen it since he was a child. "Who sent this?" he asked. "Your grandfather," Ms. Harding said. "Walter Cole." The name hit him like a punch. "When?" 12 years ago, she replied. "Shortly after you entered foster care. 12 years. For 12 years, he had believed that man had simply vanished, just like everyone else. Walked away and never looked back." His fingers traced the wax seal, the letter W pressed into it. Anger flared, sharp and sudden. followed by something far more dangerous. "Hope, what's inside?" he asked. Ms. Harding shook her head. "We were never allowed to open it. It's legally yours." She leaned forward slightly. "Whatever it is, be careful. The world outside doesn't offer much mercy." Ethan almost laughed. Mercy hadn't been part of his world for a long time. He stood, slipping the envelope into his jacket before he could change his mind. Ms. Harding wished him luck. He nodded once and walked out without looking back. Outside, the city air felt cold and sharp in his lungs. He had a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, 2 changes of clothes, a battered paperback, and $412 in cash. At the bus station, surrounded by strangers and the smell of diesel, Ethan broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a key, old brass, worn smooth by time. Beneath it was a folded document, yellow to the edges. A deed, one small parcel of land in the far north of the state, in a county he had never heard of. The purchase price was listed as $8, bought at a tax auction 13 years earlier. Owner, Walter Cole. Tucked behind was a hand-drawn map, crude and simple, with a single X marked in thick ink. Beside it were 2 words written in the same careful hand as the envelope. The Arkansas Ethan sat there, the noise of the station fading into nothing. He had no home, no safety net, no one waiting for him anywhere. Just a key, a piece of paper, and a place so far north it might as well have been the end of the world. An hour later, he bought a one-way bus ticket heading north, clutching the key like it was the last solid thing he had left. The bus ride north felt endless, like the city was being slowly peeled away layer by layer. At first, Ethan watched concrete and streetlights blur past a window, then strip malls and gas stations, and finally long stretches of road where the buildings thinned out and the sky seemed to grow wider. By the second day, the world outside had transformed completely. Fields gave way to forests, and forests grew denser, darker, heavier. Tall pines stood packed together like silent sentries, their branches weighed down by frost. The air seeping through the cracks in the bus windows was colder than anything Ethan had known, clean and sharp enough to sting his lungs. The passengers changed, too. The further north they went, the fewer people boarded. Those who did wore thick jackets and boots scarred by use. They spoke little and looked at Ethan with brief, assessing glances that lingered just long enough to make him aware he didn't belong. He clutched the envelope and its contents inside his jacket, fingers resting over the hard outline of the key whenever he drifted towards sleep. By the time the bus finally stopped in a place called Alder Creek, it was late afternoon, and the sky was already fading to a dull steel gray. The bus station was little more than a covered platform beside a 2-lane road. When the bus pulled away, it left behind a silence so complete it felt physical. The cold hit him immediately. This wasn't city cold, the kind that soaked into you slowly. This was sharp and sudden, like stepping into another world. His breath came out in thick white clouds. He shouldered his bag and walked toward the only building in sight, a small general store with a flickering sign and a single truck parked out front. Inside, the warmth felt almost shocking. The smell of coffee, oil, and old wood wrapped around him. An older man stood behind the counter, gray beard, heavy flannel shirt, eyes that missed nothing. "You lost?" the man asked. "Looking for North Ridge Road," Ethan replied, pulling out the folded map. "This place." The man studied it, squinting. "Haven't seen anyone head that way in a long time," he said. "What's out there for you?" "Property," Ethan said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. The man raised an eyebrow but said nothing, handing the map back. "That road'll take you close. After that, it's about 10 miles on foot." 10 miles? In that cold? Ethan swallowed. "Anyone live out there?" The man let out a dry laugh. "Not anymore." He glanced at Ethan's thin jacket and worn shoes. "You got family there?" "My grandfather," Ethan said. "Walter Cole." The man's expression shifted, just slightly. "Haven't heard that name in years," he said. "Quiet man. Kept to himself. Built something up on that ridge." Ethan's chest tightened. "Built. Past tense. Can I get a ride part of the way?" he asked. The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. "Name's Harris," he said. "I'll take you as far as I'm going." The truck rattled along the road, pavement giving way to gravel, gravel to frozen dirt. Trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed what little light remained. When Harris finally stopped, the forest opened into a small clearing choked with weeds and snow. "This is as far as I go," he said. "You sure about this?" Ethan nodded, though his stomach twisted. Harris handed him a flashlight. "You'll need it." The truck disappeared, leaving Ethan alone with the wind and the woods. He followed the faint path until shapes emerged from the darkness. Two long, curved metal structures sat half buried in snow and brush. Quonset huts. One was rusted through, its side torn open. The other stood intact, a crooked stovepipe jetting from the roof and a rough wooden door bolted to the front. This was it. The Arkansas Ethan's heart sank. This wasn't a home. It was a relic. He fumbled for the key, his fingers stiff from the cold. The lock resisted, then finally gave with a sharp click. Inside, the air was dead and frozen. Trapped for years. Dust coated the concrete floor. A rusted stove stood near the center, surrounded by broken furniture and a metal cot with a rotting mattress. Darkness pressed in as he closed the door behind him. Panic surged. He cannot stay like this. He stripped the mattress off the cot and dragged it outside, then pushed the frame closer to the stove. He piled his spare clothes on the springs, using his bag as a pillow. It was barely enough. His breath fogged the air. He cleared the stovepipe with a fallen branch and scavenged for dry twigs until his fingers burned with numbness. When he finally coaxed a small fire to life, it felt like a miracle. The warmth barely reached his hands, but it was something. Outside, the wind howled. Somewhere in the distance, a low, haunting sound echoed through the trees. Wolves. Ethan bolted the door shut and fed the fire piece by piece, knowing that if it went out, he might not wake up. He sat there through the long night, listening to the forest breathe around him, wondering what kind of man buys land for $8 in a place like this and calls it a lifeline. By morning, his fear had settled into something colder and more focused. Survival. He didn't know why his grandfather had sent him here. Not yet. But whatever this place was, it wasn't an accident. And if it was meant to test him, then he would face it. The cold had already made that choice for him. Morning didn't bring warmth. It brought clarity. Ethan woke stiff and aching, his joints protesting as he sat up on the metal cot. The fire had died sometime before dawn, leaving the hut wrapped in a brittle, biting cold that felt sharper than the night before. His breath hung thick in the air. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the dim light filtering through the small, grimy windows near the ceiling, trying to convince himself that this was real, that he hadn't made a catastrophic mistake. Hunger gnawed at him, dull and persistent. He reached into his bag and pulled out the last thing he had, a half-crushed bag of chips. He ate them slowly, counting each bite, knowing it was all he had until he figured something else out. The realization settled heavily in his chest. If he stayed here without supplies, he wouldn't last. Not a week, maybe not another night. He pulled on his jacket, layered his spare clothes underneath as best he could, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap. Frost coated the ground and clung to the trees, turning the forest into a frozen cathedral of white and gray. His boots crunched as he walked, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The 10 miles back to town felt longer than it had the night before. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his feet, the thin soles of his shoes offering little protection from the frozen earth. His lungs burned with every breath. More than once he had to stop, hands on his knees, fighting the urge to turn back. But turning back meant death. When he finally stumbled into Alder Creek, his legs shaking, the sun was already low again. Harris was behind the counter when Ethan pushed into the store, his face tightening with concern. "You actually went out there," he said. "Barely made it," Ethan replied, his voice rough. "You mentioned my grandfather left something." Harris nodded slowly and disappeared into the back. He returned dragging a heavy, olive-green footlocker scarred with dents and rust. "Walter told me if anyone ever came asking for him, this was theirs." Ethan knelt, his hands trembling as Harris pried the lock open with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in oilskin and plastic, were stacks of cash. Real money, hundreds bundled tight with rubber bands. Ethan froze. He counted one stack, $10,000. There were several more beneath it. His mind reeled. Beneath the money lay a bundle of letters tied with twine. On top, a single page. "Ethan, read these in order. Then you'll understand." W. The room seemed to tilt. He could leave. Right now. Buy a ticket south. Find warmth, safety, anonymity. No one would blame him. He bought boots, gloves, canned food, matches, paid Harris to hold the footlocker. Then he walked back to the hut, the weight in his bag heavier than the cold. That night, with a real fire burning and warm food in his hands, he opened the first letter. "My boy," it began, "if you're reading this, then I failed to be there when you needed me, and for that, I am sorry. But I need you to know I did not leave because I didn't love you. I left because loving you meant making myself the villain." Ethan's chest tightened as he read. The letters told the truth he had never been given. His father's debts, dangerous people, men who didn't threaten, only acted. How Walter had seen them look at a 4-year-old boy like Leverage. How he had given his son everything he had and sent him away. Then placed Ethan into the one system that would make him traceable, protected by bureaucracy. How they came for Walter instead. How he took the beating. How he lived afterward in the shadows, watching from a distance, building something for the day Ethan would need it. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. He had not been abandoned. He had been saved. The hut creaked in the wind as he folded the letter with shaking hands. The cold outside no longer felt like an enemy alone. It felt like a gate, a boundary between the boy he had been and the man he was being forced to become. Walter hadn't given him an escape. He had given him a choice. And Ethan knew, as the fire crackled and the words echoed in his mind, that this place wasn't meant to shelter him forever. It was meant to shape him. And the hardest part was still coming. The next days blurred together, not like peaceful time passing, but like survival compressing his life into a narrow tunnel. Ethan would wake, feed the stove, eat something from a can, read another letter, then stare into the fire until the words stopped feeling like ink and started feeling like a presence in the room. Walter's handwriting was steady, firm, the kind of script that belonged to someone who built things with his hands and meant what he said. Each letter peeled back another layer of Ethan's past, and with every revelation, the anger he'd carried for years melted into something heavier. Grief, loyalty, a strange, aching gratitude. He learned that Walter hadn't simply bought the land on a whim. He'd searched for a place nobody would care about, a place the world had forgotten, the same way it had forgotten Ethan. Walter called it the Ark because he didn't believe he could stop the flood, only build something that could outlast it. The hut wasn't a dream home. It was a seed, a foothold, a beginning. But Walter's plan hadn't existed in a vacuum. The further Ethan read, the clearer it became that the land had been contested even before Walter's heart started failing. A company had arrived quietly, years ago, buying up parcels in the surrounding territory. It wasn't the kind of company that put signs on the side of the road or talked about community investment. It was the kind that hired lawyers and moved in the shadows, the kind that understood that isolation made people vulnerable. Walter wrote about men in clean jackets showing up at the general store, asking questions with polite smiles, offering to help locals unlock the value of their assets. They'd come to him, too. They'd offered money. Real money. More than Ethan had in his bag, even now. Walter had refused, not because he was stubborn for the sake of it, but because he understood something Ethan was only beginning to feel. This land wasn't valuable because of what could be built on it for strangers. It was valuable because it was a place that could belong to someone who had never belonged anywhere. Ethan read the letter twice, his eyes fixed on one sentence that felt like it had been written directly into his bones. Money disappears, boy. A place to stand does not. But refusing a powerful company comes with consequences. Walter described the slow pressure that followed. Complaints filed about the structure. Accusations that the hut was unsafe, illegally modified, a hazard, a challenge to the tax sale title itself. The company had tried to drown him in paperwork, bleed him with legal fees, and wait him out. Walter, alone and aging, had fought them in his own way. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent, just unwilling to let them move him. Then the letters shifted tone. The handwriting grew less steady. The sentences shortened. Walter wrote about the doctor's visits, the fatigue that wouldn't lift, the heart that didn't keep rhythm the way it should. He wrote about time, about not having enough of it. Ethan felt dread curling in his stomach as he read, because he knew where it was leading. The final letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a command wrapped in love. They'll come when I'm gone. They'll say the land is abandoned. They'll say the structure should be condemned. They'll rely on you being scared and alone. Don't be. Claim it. Stay if you can. Build if you choose to. The money is not for running. It's for surviving long enough to decide who you want to be. Ethan folded that letter slowly, like it might break if he moved too fast. Outside, the wind pressed against the metal skin of the hut, and the trees groaned in the distance. The cold wasn't getting better. The radio he bought in town on one of the supply trips, an old handheld thing that crackled more than it spoke, warned of a deep freeze rolling down from the north, temperatures dropping hard, days of brutal, windless cold. Ethan looked around the hut and suddenly saw it the way the cold would see it, a giant steel refrigerator with a single fragile stove in the middle. The fire had kept him alive so far, but it wasn't enough. The hut was too big, too open. Heat vanished into the curved metal ceiling and died there. Walter's letters had made him brave, but bravery didn't insulate walls. Ethan did the math with a cold, practical mind. If he stayed and the cold hit hard, he could die here with money in his bag and letters in his hands. He could become another story locals told in the general store, another kid who thought stubbornness was the same as preparation. He couldn't let that be the ending. The next morning, he walked back into town with purpose. Harris watched him enter, his eyes immediately flicking to Ethan's posture. Different, not hopeful, not exactly. Determined. Back already? Harris asked. I need supplies, Ethan said. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a list he'd made by firelight, copying the urgency in Walter's words into practical needs. Insulation, plywood, tools, a hatchet, a real axe, a saw, a small generator, if one existed in town, fuel, a lantern, a better lock. Harris read the list and let out a low whistle. That's a lot for a kid living in a tin can. Ethan set a stack of bills on the counter. Harris stared. Ethan met his gaze. My grandfather left it. It's for the land. Harris didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, like something inside him had settled. All right, he said. Then we do this right. He didn't have everything, but he knew who did. A man named Roy who lived outside town, who had a generator he barely used. Another man who sold scrap lumber. A small hardware shed that wasn't much more than a barn, but had nails and screws and rolls of foil-back foam insulation. Harris talked, made calls, arranged a delivery. He also gave Ethan the first real advice that wasn't pity disguised as concern. "You can't heat the whole hut," Harris said, leaning forward. "You'll burn through you like it's paper. You need to build a smaller space inside it, a room within the room. Tight, insulated. That stove can heat a box. It can't heat a tunnel." Ethan nodded, the idea clicking into place like a lock turning. A room, a shelter inside a shelter, something he could defend. When the supplies arrived the next day on the back of a battered pickup, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since he was a little kid. The strange thrill of having the tools to change your situation. Roy showed him the generator, how to prime it, how to pull the cord just right, how to keep the fuel from gumming in the cold. It coughed and roared to life, loud and ugly, but the sound felt like power. Ethan paid him and watched the truck disappear down the road. Then he stood alone again in the clearing, facing the curved belly of the hut and the mountain of supplies at his feet. The task in front of him was enormous, and he had no idea what he was doing. He had never built anything in his life, but Walter had, and Ethan was done being passive, done being processed, done being a file. He dragged the plywood inside. He stacked the insulation. He measured a corner near the stove and marked the floor with a piece of charcoal, 10 feet by 12, small enough to warm, big enough to live. His hands shook as he picked up the saw, not from fear of the work, but from the weight of what it meant. This wasn't just carpentry. This was Ethan choosing to exist, choosing to stay, choosing to turn an inheritance into something real. He made the first cut. It was crooked. He made another, better. He drove the first nail and bent it. He pulled it out and tried again. By the end of the day, his hands were blistered, his shoulders burned, and a rough, uneven frame stood in the corner of the hut. Ugly, wobbly, but standing. Ethan stepped back and stared at it, breathing hard, and for the first time he didn't see a tin can tomb. He saw the outline of a decision made with his own hands. And outside, far beyond the trees, the deep freeze was coming. The cold arrived like a verdict. Not dramatic, not loud, just absolute. Ethan woke before dawn to a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The usual groan of wind against the curved metal walls was gone. The hut felt heavier somehow, tighter. He swung his legs off the cot inside his half-built, insulated room and immediately felt it. The way the air bit into his skin, sharper than it had been the night before. He fed the stove, watching the fire catch slowly, reluctantly, like it understood how serious this moment was. When he finally stepped outside to check the thermometer, he nailed to the wall near the door. The number didn't register at first. -38. He blinked, leaned closer. -38 and dropping. His breath came shallow. This was the kind of cold people didn't talk about casually. This was the cold that killed mistakes. He retreated inside and shut the door, bolting it with hands that felt clumsy and slow. The insulated room he'd built was still crude. Bare plywood, seams imperfect, foil-backed insulation stapled unevenly. But when the stove began to glow, something incredible happened. The heat didn't vanish into the vast metal curve of the hut. It stayed. It lingered. It pressed gently against his skin. Ethan sat on the cot, staring at the stove like it was a living thing. He ate beans straight from the can, lukewarm but filling, and listened to the radio crackle warnings about a polar front settling in. Temperatures expected to reach dangerous lows. -40, possibly lower. He turned the radio off. Words wouldn't help now. Only preparation would. Over the next 2 days, the world shrank. Ethan's entire existence became a triangle between the cot, the stove, and the small pile it would stack just outside his door. He learned quickly that everything took longer in the cold. Lighting a fire, heating food, pulling on gloves stiff with frost. He learned to sleep in short stretches, waking often to feed the stove, because letting it die wasn't an option. The metal walls of the hut popped and cracked under the strain, loud, sharp sound that jolted him awake, heart pounding every time. Outside, the forest groaned. Trees split with sounds like distant gunshots. Once, in the middle of the night, he heard the howl again. Wolves, closer than before. The sound slid through the trees and wrapped around the hut, testing it. Ethan sat up, gripping the axe he kept beside the cot, knowing full well it wouldn't help if the walls failed. He stayed awake until the sound faded, the fire crackling low and steady like a heartbeat. By the third night, the thermometer read -47. The number didn't feel real. It felt theoretical, like something from a textbook, but his body knew otherwise. Even inside the insulated room, the cold pressed in relentless. His eyelashes crusted with frost when he exhaled too close to the wall. His fingers burned when he pulled his gloves off for even a moment. The stove glowed red-hot, and still he shivered under every layer he owned. Fear crept in, quiet and insidious. Not panic. Something worse. Doubt. A voice in his head whispered that this was foolish. That Walter had been wrong. That love didn't make this survivable. That money sitting in a bag didn't matter if he froze to death beside it. Ethan closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe slowly. He thought of the letters, of Walter writing by lamplight, hand steady, knowing he wouldn't be here to explain any of it. Walter had endured this cold. Maybe not this exact night, but winters like it. He hadn't run. Ethan wouldn't either. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally won. He slept in shallow fragments, waking often to check the fire, to make sure his fingers still worked, to make sure he was still alive. When morning came, it brought no relief. The cold lingered, unmoving, like it had settled in for the long haul. The generator was useless. The fuel had thickened into sludge. The pull cord snapped back without even trying to turn the engine over. It didn't matter. The fire was everything now. On the fifth day, the cold broke. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just enough that he noticed he wasn't shaking quite as hard. The thermometer crept upward. -30, then -20. By afternoon, he stepped outside and felt something close to mercy. The forest seemed to exhale. The trees stopped cracking. The world felt alive again. Ethan stood there in the clearing, surrounded by frost and silence, and laughed. It came out hoarse and broken, but it was laughter all the same. He had survived. The thing that was supposed to kill him hadn't. Something fundamental shifted inside him then. The cold hadn't just tested his shelter. It had tested his belief in himself. And for the first time in his life, he passed. A week later, the letter arrived. It was delivered by Roy, who'd driven out with mail and supplies from town. The envelope was crisp, white, corporate. No handwritten warmth. No wax seal. Ethan knew before he opened it. He sat at the small table he'd salvaged and read the words carefully, slowly, forcing himself not to rush. Formal offer to purchase property. Cash payment. Generous consideration for undeveloped land. Then the undertone sharpened. References to unsafe structures. Environmental concerns. Potential legal action. They weren't asking. They were setting the stage. Ethan folded the letter with deliberate calm. He felt anger rise, but it was different from the anger he'd known before. It wasn't helpless. It was focused. This was what Walter had warned him about. The vultures. The company assumed he was temporary. That the kid living in a tin hut would panic at legal language and take the money. He didn't. He walked to town the next morning, the letter folded in his pocket like a challenge. Harris read it silently, jaw tightening. "They finally showed their teeth," he said. They did the same thing to Walter. Ethan nodded. I need to fight them. Harris studied him for a long moment. You don't fight companies like that alone, he said. But I know someone you should talk to. That was how Ethan met Thomas Reed, former county clerk, semi-retired, a man who knew exactly how land changed hands when people weren't paying attention. Thomas listened without interrupting, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. When Ethan finished, Thomas leaned back. They'll try to claim abandonment, he said, or nuisance, or unsafe occupancy. But you're living there, improving it. That matters. Is it enough? Ethan asked. Thomas smiled faintly. Not by itself, but there's another angle. He explained it slowly, carefully. If the hut wasn't just a residence, but a place of business, the rules changed. A workshop, a registered operation, something that contributed to the local economy. Harder to condemn, harder to bully. Ethan thought of the tools in Walter's footlocker, the chisels, the planes, the notebooks filled with careful drawings. Walter hadn't just built shelter. He'd built a workspace. My grandfather was a woodworker, Ethan said. Thomas nodded. Then maybe it's time you were too. The idea settled deep in Ethan's chest. It wasn't just strategy. It was continuity, purpose. That night, back at the hut, Ethan unlocked the footlocker fully for the first time. He laid the tools out on the table one by one, hands reverent. They felt right, balanced, alive. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood handles and felt something pass between past and present. He didn't know how to use them yet, not properly, but he would learn. He had learned to survive cold that killed unprepared men. He could learn this too. Outside, the forest stood quiet, no longer threatening. Inside, Ethan lit the stove and opened one of Walter's notebooks. The sketches were precise, patient. Boxes, tables, chairs, simple things made well. Ethan smiled faintly. The company thought they were fighting a scared kid. They were wrong. They were fighting a lineage. And the next phase of the battle had just begun. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in cautiously, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The snow thinned in patches first, revealing dark earth beneath, then retreated slowly into shadows of trees. The cold no longer ruled the days, but it hadn't loosened its grip completely either. Nights were still sharp, still demanding respect. Ethan adapted without thinking about it anymore, feeding the stove, hauling wood, checking seals in the insulated room. These things became rhythm instead of struggle. Survival had transformed into routine. But routine wasn't enough anymore. Walter hadn't built the ark just to endure winter. He'd built it to create something that could last beyond it. Ethan spent his days turning the second half of the hut into a workspace. He cleared decades of dust and debris, sweeping until his arms burned. He set up the heavy workbench Walter had half finished, tightening joints that had loosened with time. He ran extension cords from the generator and mounted a single hanging light above the bench, its glow harsh but honest. When the generator roared to life, the sound echoed across the clearing, announcing his presence of the woods like a declaration. I'm still here. He opened Walter's notebooks carefully, afraid at first that touching them would somehow erase the man who wrote them. But as he studied the drawings, something shifted. These weren't museum pieces. They were instructions meant to be used. Walter's handwriting filled the margins with notes about grain direction, joinery, patience. Ethan started small. Scrap wood, simple cuts, learning how to hold a plane so it didn't bite too deep, learning that would fought back if he rushed it. His first attempts were ugly. Board split, joints gapped. He cursed aloud more than once, frustration boiling over when a piece refused to cooperate. But each failure taught him something tangible. The difference between forcing and guiding, between speed and care. Slowly, Painfully, he improved. At night, he collapsed onto the cot, exhausted in a way he'd never known before. This wasn't the exhaustion of fear or hunger. It was earned. It was clean. One afternoon, Harris stopped by unannounced. He stood in the doorway of the hut, eyes scanning the space, the bench, the tools laid out with growing order. "Walter would have liked this," he said quietly. Ethan nodded, throat tight. "I'm trying to keep it alive." Harris handed him a small package. Nails, better screws, a few clamps. "Town's talking," he added, not in a bad way. That mattered more than Ethan wanted to admit. When he took his first finished piece into town, his hands shook. It was a small wooden box, clean lines, simple hinges. He'd sanded it until it felt like silk under his fingers. Harris turned it over slowly, inspecting the joints, the finish. "This'll sell," he said. He placed it on the counter by the register. 2 days later, a couple passing through bought it without haggling. When Harris handed Ethan the cash, it felt heavier than the money from a Foot Locker ever had. This was an inheritance. This was proof. But the company hadn't disappeared. Another letter arrived. Then another, each one sharper than the last. Legal language tightened around the threat, accusing him of zoning violations, environmental risk, improper occupancy. Ethan took them to Thomas Reed, who responded calmly, methodically. Paperwork against paperwork. Proof of residency. Proof of improvements. Proof of commerce. The Ark was no longer an abandoned structure. It was a working shop, a registered address, a presence. The developers escalated. A representative showed up in town one afternoon, clean boots, expensive jacket, smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked around, asked about Ethan. Harris shut him down politely. Others followed suit. Community, Ethan learned, wasn't loud. It was quiet resistance. It was people choosing not to cooperate. One evening, after a long day shaping a tabletop, Ethan sat outside the hut watching the sun dip behind the trees. The land looked different now. Not just something he occupied, but something he understood. The contours, the way the wind moved, the way sound carried. He thought about the choice he'd made months ago, how close he'd been to running, how easy it would have been to disappear. He didn't feel brave thinking about it. He felt grateful. Grateful that Walter had believed he could be more than what the system labeled him. Grateful that the cold hadn't won. Grateful that the fight wasn't over, because the fight meant he had something worth defending. That night, as the generator hummed and the stove crackled, Ethan opened the final page of Walter's notebook. At the bottom, written in larger letters than the rest, were words that hadn't been part of any design. Build something that remembers you. Ethan closed the book slowly. He looked around the hut, the insulated room, the bench, the tools, the stacks of finished and half-finished pieces. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming someone. And the company, the cold, the system that tried to discard him, they had all underestimated the power of a person who finally decided to stay. By summer, the land felt awake. Not gentle, not welcoming, but alive in a way that demanded attention. The forest hummed with insects and birds, and the long daylight hours stretched Ethan's workdays until he barely noticed time passing. Sweat replaced frost as his constant companion. The hut, once a place of desperate shelter, now felt like a forge. The smell of cut wood mixed with oil and smoke, and the steady rhythm of hand tools striking, shaving, shaping filled the space where silence once ruled. Ethan's hands were permanently marked now, knuckles rough, palms calloused. They told a story his old case files never could. Orders began to come in slowly at first. Harris sold a second box, then a third. A local lodge owner commissioned a set of stools. Nothing large, nothing extravagant, but real work. Each piece left the hut carrying more than function. It carried proof of existence, proof that something good could come from a place meant to erase him. The letters from the developers stopped being offers and started becoming warnings. Notices of inspection, threats of condemnation hearings, thinly veiled suggestions that it would all go easier if Ethan cooperated. Thomas Reed coached him through each response. Calm, documented, relentless. They were building a case without ever stepping into a courtroom. And then came the visit. Ethan saw the truck before he heard it. Tires crunching slowly up the dirt track. A dark SUV, clean enough to look absurd against the dust and pine needles. Two men stepped out. Both wore button-down shirts despite the heat. Sleeves rolled just enough to appear casual. One of them smiled. "Ethan Cole," he asked. Ethan didn't offer his hand. "You know who I am," he said. The taller man nodded. "We represent Blackridge Holdings. We'd like to talk." "You're standing on private property," Ethan replied evenly. The smile tightened. "We won't take much of your time." They walked inside the hut without waiting for permission, eyes scanning the space. The bench, the tools, the finished pieces stacked neatly against the wall. The smile faded. This wasn't what they'd expected. "You're running a business out of here?" the shorter man asked. "Yes," Ethan said, fully registered. "This structure isn't zoned for commercial use," the taller one said. "It is," Ethan replied, "under a grandfather exception." He let the word hang there. Grandfather. They exchanged a glance. "You could avoid a lot of trouble," the tall man said carefully. "We're prepared to increase our offer." "No," Ethan said. "Just that." The shorter man scoffed. "You think you can win this?" "I think I already am," Ethan replied. Silence filled the hut, thick and uncomfortable. The men left without another word. 2 weeks later, the notice arrived. A formal hearing scheduled at the county office. Condemnation review. Ethan read it twice, then folded it calmly and placed it in a drawer. He drove into town and met Thomas and Harris at the diner. "This is it," Thomas said. "They're forcing the issue." Ethan nodded. "Then we finish it." The hearing room was small, wood-paneled, outdated. 3 officials sat behind a long table. The developer's lawyer spoke first, confident, polished. He painted a picture of unsafe structures, environmental hazards, an irresponsible young man squatting on land that could be properly developed. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood slowly. He didn't bring theatrics. He brought documentation, permits, sales records, photos of improvements, letters from locals who had purchased his work. Harris spoke. So did the lodge owner. Even Thomas, officially retired, offered his testimony. Ethan spoke last. "This land was bought for $8, he said. Not because it was worthless, but because no one cared enough to claim it. My grandfather did. He built something here. I'm continuing it. This place isn't abandoned. It's alive." Silence followed. The officials conferred quietly. When they returned, the decision was clear. Condemnation denied. Review closed. The developer's lawyer packed his briefcase without meeting Ethan's eyes. Outside, the sun felt warmer than it had any right to. Harris clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Walter would have been proud," he said. Ethan swallowed hard. That night, back at the Ark, Ethan sat on the step outside the hut and watched the stars emerge one by one. The land was quiet, settled. He thought about the boy who'd arrived here with nothing but fear and a key. He thought about the man who'd written letters in the dark, trusting that someone would read them and choose to stay. Home, he realized, wasn't safety. It was responsibility. It was choosing to care for something when leaving would be easier. He stood and went back inside, running his hand along the workbench, the grain smooth beneath his fingers. Tomorrow, there would be more orders, more work, more challenges. But tonight, he allowed himself one simple truth. He had not been erased. He had been rebuilt. The first winter anniversary passed quietly. No ceremony, no dramatic moment. Just Ethan waking up before dawn, the same way he always did, and realizing the cold no longer scared him. It still demanded respect, but it no longer ruled him. The stove burned steady. The insulated room held its warmth, and the hut, scarred, dented, imperfect, stood exactly where it had a year earlier. Still his, still standing. Outside, frost clung to trees again, but this time Ethan noticed the beauty in it. The way the light caught the ice, the way the forest breathed. He brewed coffee on the stove and sat at the small table he'd built himself, hands wrapped around the mug, and let the quiet settle. A year ago, he had arrived here broken, terrified, and convinced this place would be his grave. Now it was his anchor. The business grew slowly but steadily. No sudden success. No overnight transformation. Just consistency. Word spread beyond Alder Creek. People drove hours to buy his work. They didn't come because it was trendy. They came because they could feel the care in it, the patience, the refusal to cut corners. Ethan learned to talk to customers, to listen to what they wanted without losing what mattered to him. He learned that saying no was just as important as saying yes. He hired help eventually, one local kid who reminded him too much of himself to ignore. Teaching felt strange at first. He wasn't used to being the one with answers. But as he showed the kid how to plane a board properly, how to read grain, how to slow down, he understood something important. The system that failed him didn't get to be the end of his story. He was building something that could outlast him, just like Walter had intended. The developers didn't disappear completely. Companies like that never truly do. But they shifted their focus elsewhere. Easier land, easier targets. The arc was no longer worth the effort. Too visible, too defended, too rooted. On the wall of the workshop, Ethan hung one of Walter's old photographs. It showed a younger man standing beside the hut in its earliest days, one hand resting against the curved metal wall, expression calm, resolved. Ethan talked to that photo sometimes. Not out loud, just in the quiet moments. He didn't ask questions anymore. He understood enough. The past stopped feeling like something chasing him and started feeling like something holding him steady. One evening, long after sunset, Ethan finished locking up and stepped outside. The sky was clear, stars sharp against the black. He stood there, breathing in the cold air, and thought about the moment that changed everything. The envelope, the key, the choice. He could have left. That truth never stopped being real. He could have taken the money and disappeared into comfort. No one would have judged him. But then this place wouldn't exist. This version of him wouldn't exist. He wouldn't know what it felt like to earn warmth with his own hands, to defend something that mattered, to choose permanence in a world built on disposability. Home, he realized, wasn't about safety or comfort or walls that kept the cold out. Home was commitment. It was deciding that something was worth staying for even when leaving would be easier. It was building when no one was watching. It was choosing to become instead of escape. Ethan closed the door behind him and turned off the lights. Inside the hut, the workshop rested quietly, tools laid out with care, projects waiting for morning. Outside, the land held him the way it always had. Not gently, honestly. Somewhere in the silence, he felt Walter's presence. Not as a ghost, not as a memory weighed down by regret, but as a steady echo of intention. The ark had done what it was meant to do. It carried something precious through the flood. Not furniture, not money, a person, a future. Ethan Cole, once a case number, once disposable, once forgotten, stood rooted in a place bought for $8 in the coldest part of the state. He didn't just survive it. He built something that proved he was never meant to disappear, and that, more than warmth or shelter, was what finally felt like home. If this story touched your heart, it's probably because part it felt familiar, Maybe you felt abandoned, forgotten, or forced to start over with nothing. Maybe you stood at a crossroads where leaving would have been easier than staying. Stories like this remind us that even in the coldest, loneliest places, something meaningful can be built. If you believe in second chances, in resilience, and in the power of choosing to stay when the world expects you to disappear, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that matter. Stories about survival, purpose, and finding home when it feels impossible. And remember, home isn't something you're given. It's something you build